So what do you think are the main issues that we're facing in dentistry at the moment?
Well, back to education again. You know, when I started in the dental industry, there was a huge understanding of what materials did, the science of whatever that material was, whether it was amalgam or silicates or composites or whatever those materials were, gold foil, you know, what their purpose was and when they were to be implemented. And there's a lot less of that nowadays. There's wonderful material science going on, especially here in the United Kingdom, but sometimes the students, you know, they're still not just in the United Kingdom, but around the world, the correlation of why this material versus that material in this application. And, you know, one of the things that I try to stress in the lectures that I do is I try to get everybody to go back to the beginning. You know, you go to a lot of lectures and you always hear products compared to other products, but we never compare the product to the tooth. And that always amazed me, and it sort of woke me up a few years ago. I was at a very famous clinician's lecture, and he was doing this product against that product, and this adhesive against that adhesive, and I'm sitting there thinking about the poor tooth. Where's the tooth and all this? And everybody wants to call their material the gold standard, and I think we were born with the gold standard. And so I have a chart that I put in my lectures, you know, the tooth, and then these different materials. And how do we compare to what we had when we were born? You know, what nature gave us. You know, and so one of the first educational standpoints is, you know, we're repairing nature. We're not repairing just something that's like glass or something that's kind of like wood. You know, oftentimes dentin is sort of treated like wood, you know, with especially in adhesive technologies, the way, not so much today, but in the early days, you know, it was like, oh, we got to get a thin layer in and then a thicker layer, and how many layers do you put in of lacquer before you put in the composite? And now we're understanding there's this thing called collagen, and there's these minerals, and there's two types of water. There's bound and there's free water, and they all have a purpose. And then there's these wonderful things called proteins. And what are we doing with these proteins, with all these acids and things that are coming into the dentin? We're starting to really think about what are we doing to that nature. And so then there's the functionality of that nature. You know, we tend to think largely about the chemistries, but then there's this micromechanical behaviors that are going on. You know, again, a lot of us, we tend to think of enamel as like glass. And so, you know, so many materials, you know, you go to talk about your material and someone else is saying, well, it's not as hard as, it's not as strong as. And you go, well, that material you're referring to is like harder and stronger than the tooth. And so now we're starting to become aware of what's it doing to the opposing dentition. You know, you did this filling here with this material that is so hard, but what's it doing to the opposing dentition? You know, so sometimes we can go too far by thinking we have to make it so hard. And so enamel is like this, you know, excuse me if I'm going on about this, you know, it's kind of a passion of mine, is you look at the way a tooth develops from this little tiny bud, and then all these different crystalline structures evolve from this, all the while water is just flowing from the inside out. It's alive. But yet when we get in there, sometimes we're treating it more like it's just something. You know, it's a thing. And so I think the research community, which I love being involved in, is everyone is waking up and they're realizing, hey, there's a physical dynamic taking place. Enamel is actually this incredible crystalline structure that's, you know, it's taking these biting forces and it's dispersing them over the whole crown of the tooth, you know. And the dentin, which is a completely different crystalline structure, is actually absorbing these shocks and also taking these flexes that are going in multiple different directions. And so the tooth is able to respond in its own way with all of these dynamics, all for the purpose of protecting the pulp, which is the heart of the tooth. And so that's where life is coming from. you know, and so the tooth becomes infected, you know, for whatever reason, you know, and so what does the tooth do? Well, it sends albumin, you know, carrying phosphate and calcium to go attend to that acidic involvement or that bacterial invasion. You know, it has its own defense mechanisms. And the more we understand how the tooth tries to defend itself and or heal itself, I think that should direct the future of dental materials. And where we're working with nature rather than just patching nature, which is essentially what we've been doing. You know, one of my heroes in the dental research community is Dr. Jack Faircane from Oregon. And I really love a quote of his from last year he did an editorial piece for dental materials, and he's the past president of the American Association of Dental Research. And he was talking about the future, you know, of how things are going to change. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read this. You know, and Dr. Faircane, again, he's a PhD researcher. He's the head of the Department of Restorative Dentistry at Oregon Health and Science University. This was in Dental Clinics North America in 2017. It was the EPUB on biomaterials for oral health. He said, in the future, the desire for biomaterial to be inert and non-harmful to the patient, which is basically most of today's current materials, while still relevant and necessary, will no longer be considered sufficient. New materials currently being introduced, under development, or simply envisioned are expected to be bioactive, and that they will be intended to interact in some positive way with the oral environment. These materials will provide a wide range of diverse functions, including the routine inhibition of bacterial biofilm formation, remineralization of lost dentin and enamel, and the regeneration of diseased pulp, bone, and soft tissues. See, what he's talking about are materials that, as Larry Hinch, who's from the UK, he's the first person to define what bioactivity was for material coatings of hip implants here in London. And he defined it as a material that actually elicits a response from the hard and the soft tissues. In other words, it's not the material that's really the answer. It's recognized the material is eliciting the body, which is the answer to do something. And that's a very important distinction, is that we develop materials that actually elicit a response and let the body do what the body does. And the body wants to be in balance, and it wants to help itself. Mm-hmm. It's just the way we were created. And the tooth is no different. The tooth is, if it's out of balance in ions, it's trying to find those ions, whether it's calcium, phosphate, or in enamel for fluoride. And so, you know, I think, you know, we've been on the verge of this for a lot of years. You know, glass ionomers have been seen as bioactive with tremendous fluoride release, and there's other things happening with that fluoride release because fluoride is important. You know, fluoride expedites the binding of calcium and phosphate, and makes that process, now what we call fluoroapatite, more acid resistant to the pH changes in the mouth. And so, but when the pH drops below 5.5, according to Silverstone and Featherstone and others, it's calcium and phosphate coming out of the tooth. And once that comes out, the tooth is actually looking to get it back. Mm. And so there's this dynamic that's we don't pay enough attention to, and so one of the things that we tried to do as a company is we tried to become involved in that dynamic behavior by developing urethane dimethacrylate resins that are sensitive to those pH changes and will take on and give back those ions as well. And that's just working with nature, you know, and so.
And do you think, are there any particular markets, Larry, that are more receptive to these types of messages, or do you think it's sort of a worldwide concern? So, for example, is Europe very different to the rest of the rest of Europe different to the UK, or over in the States, or Australasia? Do you see any sort of patterns of markets that are more ready to take on board these types of messages?
Well, it's definitely segmented worldwide.
Yeah.
One of the interesting aspects of being a pioneer or a missionary, as I call myself oftentimes when I talk about bioactivity, is you find out exactly where everyone is at regarding this subject matter. Because some people clearly think they have everything they need. On the other hand, it also comes back to education. Again, remembering how the tooth works and how we play to its best advantage. The other thing I've learned is in the countries where glass ionomer is more prolific or dominant, like in Europe and in Australia, for example, and Japan, there's always been an understanding of bioactivity, even though it wasn't necessarily calling out calcium and phosphate. The focus was more about fluoride. There's been more reception in that area. And then in certain countries like in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, I've seen a high regard for bioactivity. I mean, it was almost immediate because it was like for a long time they had this desire, if you will. It's like they knew all along, there was this void, and so that's been very exciting and rewarding. In the United States, we're all about bonding, composites and bonding. And so to talk about composites that actually act like a little bit like a glass ionomer, but it also has calcium and phosphate, and it's interacting with the tooth, you get a lot of, I don't understand what you're talking about. I didn't get that education in dental school. And I would say that it's probably a little bit in every country I go to as well. It's kind of university dependent, depending on the philosophies at that school. There are some schools in the UK that are very biomaterials related, but their definition may be with the existing technologies versus looking to the future. So in the UK, it's very big to be involved in bioglass, and that's great. Please come to market. but we need the manufacturers buying into this as well. Manufacturers play a huge role in the influencing of what goes on in these different countries because so much funding of research is really done by the manufacturers. And so, manufacturers, if they have an opinion about what they want to go with, that's what they're going to push.
Okay.
Same for us, except we're actually trying to get everybody else to, look to the future, just like Dr. Fairkane is talking about.